Our next panel will share examples and ideas for how to apply inclusive design practices when delivering digital products and services. Please welcome the Director of Design at Fearless, Jordan Watts.
All right. Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. Hope everyone had a nice, delicious lunch. I'm sure we're all experiencing the afternoon's slump, but I am so excited and honored to be up on this stage with my esteemed panelists. So I'm Jordan Watts. I'm the Director of Design at Fearless. We are a civic tech, government tech firm in Baltimore. And I was just thinking at lunch, so struck by Secretary Gill's opening remarks when he talked about the importance of government services being comparable to the services that you would receive in the private sector. So he gave he referenced Disney. And so at Fearless, we are doing the hard work to rebuild trust in the American government. The trust in government is at an all-time low, and we really believe that good technology with good design is the way to do that. So I'm very honored to be a part of that. So we're here to talk about inclusive design. So I brought on stage some tech leaders from media, from the nonprofit sector, from commercial tech, and from public utilities. And so just to start off, I want to give a quick introduction to inclusive design, which I know can be kind of an abstract concept, and it's really exciting to be at an age where we're talking about inclusivity and inclusion on the regular. But I want to give just a really quick story from my own personal life, if I might, to explain inclusive design. So I'll tell a quick story about my father, who was a kindergarten teacher for over 30 years. So for 3 decades, he taught 5-year-olds how to read. And he was so good at teaching 5-year-olds how to read that he actually created the curriculum for early childhood education in his school district. And 3rd grade teachers would send their kids to his school, to his classroom, rather, if they were struggling to learn how to read. He was so gifted at that. The other part of that story is that my dad, he couldn't read himself until he was in high school. And so when he was a freshman in high school, his English teacher noticed that he was having difficulty with the assignments and took extra care to work with him until he could read at a ninth grade level. And I think this is a perfect example of the power of inclusive design, because inclusion really means meeting people where they are and understanding that those folks with lived experiences of the challenges of accessing services, products, technology, things like that, they have the key to solving those problems. And it's about involving the people that you're designing for, that you're creating technology for in the process. That's the key to technology. And I firmly believe that the reason why my father was such a gifted teacher, especially with literacy, is because he himself faced those struggles. So I want to turn it over to my panelists now, who are going to do most of the talking. And so I'm going to start off with a quick question. We're going to start off with Solomon. I'm going to ask everyone to give a quick explanation, give a quick introduction of themselves, and an explanation of what is inclusive design and why does it matter?
So my name is Solomon Scott. I am one of the engineering leads at the Washington Post, where I lead a team of developers and I help manage the entire article experience for the Post. So any article that you see, that's my team and that's how we manage it out. So for me, inclusive design is thinking not just about, I want to say not more obvious, but like more things that you think about, like, people who are blind, who might be deaf, who might like use your product, but also thinking across different like spectrums of the whole. So like gender, race, like generation, even we've been doing something now where we've been trying to work on getting multi-generations to to read the Post and how they consume it and the way that is best for them. Like we're used to reading, we're used to like watching videos now, but Gen Z is such a quick generation that how do we build stuff for them, right? So that's what we've been thinking about. And it matters because as Jordan said, when you need to consume something, you need to really take it in and figure it out, all right, what does it mean to me? And I think especially for the media sector, like for the Post, we want to make sure everyone as a whole can consume it and understand exactly what like our news team is writing, and get like all the information, especially with like COVID and war in Ukraine. So we want to make sure like people can really understand it. So not just like someone who picks up the newspaper to read it, or even like goes to the site, but like if you're on your phone and you're like a quick read, how do you consume like what's happening at the Post? That's actually what my team is doing now. We're like trying to find a way to like make the news more of a social aspect. So yeah.
Thank you for that, Solomon. Christine, I'd love to hear your perspective.
Sure. My name's Christine Jackson. I'm the Director of Digital Strategy at the National Aquarium. And when I think about inclusive design, I like to think about making it so that all of your products are inclusive for no matter who is taking them in. So everyone's having the same experience. So that means taking it a step beyond just being accessible, because you can meet accessibility standards but still not be letting someone have the same experience. So just because someone is consuming your product in a slightly different way doesn't mean that they shouldn't feel the content and understand the story and really come along the journey that everyone else that you were quote unquote expecting to hit your site should experience. So that's how we're trying to kind of expand our view of things. So taking it beyond just the accessible standpoint and making sure that everyone is having the same experience holistically together.
Thanks, Christine. Shannon, I would love to hear your thoughts as well.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Shannon Husmer, Group Creative Director at Mindgrub. We're a full-service digital agency located in Baltimore, and I help run the design team. For me, inclusive design is really a part of kind of the expanding conversation around disability that I'm really excited about. It used to be about like the individual and your own personal issues, but now the conversation is about really the mismatch between any human's ability and any context they find themselves within. So that really expands the circle of whom we're talking about, whom we're impacting with this type of design. Every one of us in this room will experience some type of disability, whether it be temporary, whether it be situational, whether it be permanent, and that is why this is so important to me. I think about myself and the products I'm making, and am I going to be able to use them? Are my friends, are my family going to be able to use them? And just thinking about that wider circle.
I love that. Thanks. Please round us out, Christine.
Thank you for having me. My name is Correa, and I'm a principal product designer at Exelon. Exelon is a Fortune 500 company that serves millions of customers with their energy needs, including customers in Maryland. So when I think about inclusive design, +1 to everything that has been said so far, but I think about this illustration that a teammate of mine posted recently. And then in this illustration, you can see that it's a snowy day, and there's snow on this ramp, and there's snow on the stairs leading up to the building. And there are like 10 people crowded around the stairs, rushing the person to shovel the snow off the stairs. And there's one person in a wheelchair waiting to use the ramp, and no one is cleaning the ramp. And everyone's saying, hurry up, clean the stairs, we need to get into the building. But the person in the wheelchair is like, if you clean the ramp, everyone can use it. You're not excluding anyone. So to me, that's like a great way to explain, what inclusive design means. Not falling into the trap of, ROI, let's serve most of our customers, but instead thinking creatively, how can we serve all our customers? And the reason it's important is because, equal access, making sure everyone can use the product, like Christine said, in a similar manner.
I love that. Thank you. And so, Christine, this is a perfect segue, I think, to you. You were talking about the importance of accessibility, other factors as well. So you are the Director of Digital Strategy for the National Aquarium, which obviously has a huge conservation impact, over 6 million web visitors a year, but there's also a building, in-person component. So I'm curious for you, how does inclusive design factor into the customer experience or even the coworker experience at the aquarium?
Yeah, so if we want to go all the way back in time to when COVID originally hit, we temporarily closed down like many businesses. And then when we were reopening, we were thinking everything through, and it was obviously very hectic, and we didn't know what was the safest things for our staff and for our guests, and how will people feel safe about coming back, and how do we make everyone feel included. One of the things that some people were suggesting is that we should close our ticket center and everything should just be tickets online, no touch, no human contact. And then we took a step back and we were like, we have guests and clients and customers who may not have access to credit cards, who are still cash-based, who still deserve the right to come to the aquarium and experience our education, our conservation messaging, and so we can't close our ticketing center. So we would encourage people to buy ahead, buy online, if you can, but we would still be doing ticket sales at the gate. And so that's like a person-to-person, in business kind of. A lot of times everyone wants to change everything over to digital so fast, but then you might accidentally be leaving people behind. So instead of making it one or the other, create a pathway for everyone and encourage people to go down one path that you're hoping to like mitigate risk with, but never cut off a whole group by accident by not thinking about it from other people's perspectives and other communities that you may not be a part of. And so that kind of trickles back into how we redesigned the website, making sure that we were showing it to everyone across the organization as we rebuilt it to see how would you use the site, testing it with, third-party organizations to say, where would you click around to get to the animal page, or what would you expect to go down this path? And then being honest and adjusting when things don't fit your normal, and making sure that you're building something that everyone can understand and have access to, so that you're not in the constant cycle of explaining why you did it your way and not the way that makes sense to the larger demographic group.
Such important perspective. Solomon, I want to go to you next, just as a comparison of scale. So, you were telling me at lunch the Washington Post's website gets about 20 million visitors a day. And so we're thinking about it as a single source of information, or a digital platform. What are some of the important factors to consider when designing for accessibility? Or obviously you're a very talented engineer as well, or even for engineering for accessibility.
Yeah. So for us, as engineers, there's things we can do on our side to ensure accessibility, of course. But we always try to go not even a step further, but a step back up the chain. So engineers are usually the last people to sort of build something out, and then that's when it's launched at that point. But how can we work with the designers, the newsroom, even further than that, and just in terms of how we're not even writing the content, but how are we designing our content, right? So I try to get work with our team earlier on to say okay, not only are you writing it, but maybe do you have other mediums that you can possibly extend this to, right? So we, of course, have the written paper. We have the website. WAPO, surprisingly, has a really strong TikTok presence, surprisingly enough, which is great. But we try to incorporate that as a whole to ensure not only accessibility for a wide array of it's that people who may be deaf or visually impaired, but people who may read content in a different way. I think you made a good point of how do you, or expanding to people who are not just different ethnic backgrounds, but different monetary backgrounds. How do we access make content free and that kind of right? So we even had a plan back when COVID hit, let's make all our COVID articles free. And that ensures a level of accessibility that anyone who doesn't want to pay for a post subscription can still understand what's happening in today's world. So how can we send that out? And even bring it back to the engineering side, there are things that we can do ourselves, just to build things in a way of even if you have screen readers, we do so many tests just to make sure that our content on the website is, if you need to consume it in any kind of fashion, you can do that without trying too hard. And we even sometimes try to set ourselves up for success by not even seeing it in the way we usually see it ourselves, but just using the site from that perspective for a week, just to try it out. So. Yeah.
I like how you frame accessibility and inclusion around intersections, because humans are, there is a broad spectrum of human experience, and it's not just one thing, it's sort of the confluence of factors. But I think something that you also introduced is a really good point, is pushing accessibility further to the left, where even as you're thinking about what's not just at the code, not at the code level or the delivery level, like can we make this accessible, but is this idea, like in and of itself, can it be done in an accessible way or in a way that people can access? Shannon, I want to turn to you because you're working in the the commercial space. Mindgrub is designing really innovative mobile experiences and VR and AR and things like that. How do you factor inclusive design further to the left? So from the ground up for your products and services.
I'll start with the hard part first and then maybe move into some of the easier steps you can take. But I really think it's necessary to build it into the DNA of your organization. We want to make technology that makes people's lives better fundamentally, and then also baking it into the North Star of any process work you do. Like if whatever you're doing, you're centering the human experience, then you're going to get at inclusive design faster. You're going to achieve those results you want with inclusive design, with accessibility. And then I want to say next would become education, educating your own team, educating your clients. Why is it important in general? And then how do you deploy it? Just understanding the practicalities of WCAG and 508 compliance. And then I think for me, the biggest part of it is having the space, making the space to do research, to understand your audience, to understand the people that you're making these products for. Even if you can back away from the technology aspect of it and just center or think about, dive deep as you possibly can into what the human experience is of interacting with a company, for instance.
I love that, yeah. And I think you touched on some really important points. I think some of the earlier speakers talked about the behavioral aspects of like the behavior change that's required for digital transformation. And I think a lot of what you just described was not just on the technical side, but on the cultural side. Like there's a cultural foundation that's required to deliver accessible technology or inclusive services and things like that. So Christine, I want to turn to you now, and I know you recently won an award for some of the data visualization that you've done for the outage tracker for BGA. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you factored inclusive design into that work. You talked a little bit about universal design as well, and how an inclusive practice or an accessible technique can serve many people. Many audiences. I'd love to hear a little bit about your approach in designing public utilities that people access through technology.
Yeah, I'll say at Exelon, accessibility is a work in progress, and that's going to be at most organizations. Our main goal is, to keep improving the processes, with that in mind that, we are going to make our products more and more accessible. There's not this point where we hit and then we can check the box. The main goal is to constantly keep improving and make our products more accessible. So with any product that we take, I'll say there are 3 parts to it. So the first thing is education. The second one is having processes in place. And the third one is accountability. So I'll dive a little deeper into each step. So with education, what we did was, with all of Custom IT, we had these training sessions, these hands-on workshops, where we started with empathy mapping. We created personas, and the personas were people with different abilities. So for example, someone who might have a tremor and they're trying to pay their utility bill, or it is someone who has memory loss and they are trying to remember what their last month's bill was, or something like that. So we took these real life scenarios and we applied it to the utility space, and we started the training that way to help our employees build that empathy and to step into the shoes of our customers and then go through the entire training that way. So we started with that. So that's part of education, and then also now we've use these training sessions to also add to our onboarding processes. So any new employee starting gets to experience this training. And then, we work with a lot of vendors, we work with a lot of business partners. So in that education aspect, we also, iterate what our policies are and, try to align with, hey, this is what you need to do in order to meet our accessibility standards. So that part is also important with working with our business partners and vendors. And second, you move to the processes component, and this is like, I can talk about this all day, but at a high level, something that Solomon, you mentioned, like content. Our content designers take this really seriously, and especially with long COVID and cognitive disabilities, always getting ignored, something as simple as content, working to make sure it's accessible by all our readers, and then also thinking about like research. Shannon mentioned that when you do research, we also make sure that in our screener questions, we are thinking about a diverse audience and making sure we have diverse participants in our research. And then even in our developmental practices, I will say, our design system, the main thing is that it is accessible. Every component is accessible by default. And then I'll also touch on quality assurance. When we are going to put a product out or we are going to put an enhancement out, we want to make sure we are testing it. So we test it across different browsers and also different screen readers, also make sure keyboard accessibility is taken into account. So there are lots of processes in place to ensure that we are delivering accessible products and constantly improving it. And then lastly, accountability, which is so important. And you said, right, it has to be built into the DNA of the organization. So we have a core pillar that is DEI, and accessibility falls under that pillar of DEI. So when that accountability is already there in place, people know they need to live up to that. All the 3 steps fall, well into place and come together and allow our employees to make our products accessible.
So many good pieces of advice. Something that really strikes me about what you just said is the importance of empathy, because I think, like Solomon, you mentioned, there are people who might be using screen readers as their primary mode of like accessing content on your website. And so like being able to empathize with how difficult it, for example, it might be for someone who's trying to understand when their power is going to come back on if their screen reader can't access the website. That's an important tool. I'm interested from the perspective of the group, knowing that like these decisions about, whether it be engineering things sort of like further to the right or deciding on which personas to design for further to the left. Do you have any advice for our audience about how to prioritize or get buy-in for prioritizing accessibility and inclusion in design?
Yeah, I think for me, the advice I would give is, and something we mentioned before, just having empathy, but talking to other people. I mean, you yourself, even if you come from a diverse background, you cannot encompass every single possible piece of culture that may exist out here. So if you can talk to other people and you'll expand your circle more, you'll actually become more inclusive in that, right? And you'll hear things that you would never thought of. I mean, even before the posts never thought of we need to have content for different things. We can just write content on the web, people will read it. And then you talk to people who are different. They're like, oh, well, I read this content, but it didn't sink into me. And you're like, oh, why? And you're just thinking it's too long. Or I don't know, someone was like, I can't see it. And it's over Zoom, and you're like, oh, wait, you can't actually see it. You're blind. And it's like, yeah, so I need someone to read it to me. And even that alone is thinking, okay, these are things that I perceive as my normal, but it's not someone else's normal. I think when you have the conversation with someone else and you realize what their normal is, you realize there is no such thing as a normal, and you need to put a compass for so many other people's normals. And that's when you have that conversation with other people, you find that out much more and expand your circles.
I think a really easy way to get buy-in for something like this is to say that, however you feel about big tech companies like Google and everything like that, if you're starting to build your products with inclusivity in mind, you're building it clean, and you're not holding it down, you're not bugging it down. So inevitably, it will start to rank higher because there are more ways for all of the different kinds of bots to start exploring your own products. And so that is a really easy way to explain it to someone who's like, I don't really get it. Like, what's the ROI on it other than just the real ROI of everyone having access and being able to experience it together? It would be like, well, you know, if we're competing with another organization and we're similar on all of these other things, but we've started adding transcripts to all of our audio files, or we've started adding audio read versions of all of our written articles so that people can either listen or read depending on where they are. And the other site doesn't have that. Eventually you will start to outrank them because you're already doing things that the bots are going to start looking for eventually when it comes to the new factors that they're starting to look for in the future.
Oh, such great advice. And I like the way that you frame accessibility and focusing on accessibility as a potential competitive advantage. How about the flip side of that? Like, what are some common challenges that you found when trying to design for inclusion, or Shannon, I'm sure it's not always very flashy to design a highly accessible website, but like, what are some of the challenges that you've faced when convincing or getting buy-in for accessible practices and inclusive design practices?
I think I would make a business argument here and say, if at all possible, if you can consider inclusivity and accessibility up front, it's going to cost you less in the long run to do that work than if you wait till your product already exists and is out in the world to consider it later. And you can frame it to yourself, to your organization, externally, how you want to frame it. Like, it's something to be proud of, it's something to stand by, and it's something to really, show how you're embodying the values that you care about, baked into the digital services, the digital products that you're putting out into the world.
Right. Excellent point. And I think I'm reminded of Solomon, your comment from earlier when you described the thought process in making some of the COVID articles free, or making the COVID content on the post free, and just realizing at the very front of the process that there would be a large potential audience that wouldn't be able to access the content because of a paywall or things like that. So just appreciate that perspective. I want to, before we go into audience questions, I'm hoping that we can just, we'll start with you, Chris Ann. If you could give our audience one piece of advice, if they were to do one thing to make their technology more inclusive, what would you recommend? And we'll go one by one through the group.
Yeah, I would say, I think the first thing is to start with the education component, educate yourself. And then also that could enable you to educate, other teammates that you're working with. And I think then looking into your customer base, talking to your customers, trying to understand what their needs are, that would be a really, really strong starting point.
I love that. Yeah. What I'm reminded of is at Fearless, we're huge proponents of human-centered design. Mm-hmm. And I think a core factor of human-centered design that's often overlooked is that, like, we are not our users, we are not our customers, and it requires talking to them and meeting them where they are to really understand their needs.
Exactly.
So, Shannon, what advice would you give our audience?
It's a great question. I think I would say, be that person in the room who is the advocate, who's speaking up for inclusive design, for accessibility. Educate yourself, and then you can be that champion who is bringing the conversation to the table, because it may be, it's starting to become more part of the general conversation, like you mentioned, like part of the zeitgeist. It's starting to be demanded by more of our clients, and that momentum you can take advantage of, but I would just encourage everyone to go out there and fight the good fight, because not everyone is going to speak up, because some of this work is hard, some of this work costs money. It could be extra, it's something that you maybe weren't planning to do, but it's worth it.
And to the point that was made earlier, it can often be cheaper to solve the problem before it becomes a problem, and by prioritizing it from the start. So, Christine, what advice would you give our audience?
I mean, it's serendipitous, because my advice is going to be build it into your budget. Like, from the very beginning, don't have it be something that someone can say, oh, let's just take that $5,000 out of the budget for that modeling or that testing. Have it be just as important as like your UX, UI design at the front end, because paying for strangers who don't know your product and don't know you to play around in it and tell you things that you would never think about before is like completely worth it in the long run. And having it be baked in from the very beginning means that it's harder for someone to take it out of your project at the last minute, or for you to try to fight for it when you remember it on the back end.
Very, very strategic advice, Christine. Solomon, what advice would you give our audience?
I think to start, everyone's gave amazing things. It's actually funny, something you said, Jordan, like, human-centered design, like talk to everyone else, but also talk to your team. When you have a team who can be just as diverse too, they can also give you like amazing ideas and amazing things to start with. So diversify your team, diversify, who they talk to and stuff like that. And I think when you have that team who is diverse, you can get a lot of different minds in the room already without having to do it, like just from the get-go, a focus group from external teams. So yeah, diversify your team and always have empathy with that, so yeah.
That's great advice. I'm reminded of some advice that was given to me by Jesse Alton years ago about the perfect human-centered design. The perfect human-centered solution is one that's viable, feasible, and desirable. And I think about the feasibility in that, for example, talking to engineers and trying to understand. So, I'm a designer. I might not be the most technical person in the room, but I know that this is important. Can you help me understand like what's possible and how we can do that? So. I want to close out the session with some audience questions. So welcome folks in the room to submit to stand up and ask a question on the mic, or if there's folks who are watching at home who have questions for our audience, to submit them.
Hi, thank you very much for that presentation. I'm Darcy Gentleman, U.S. Pharmacopoeia. And I wanted to pick up on some of the threads you mentioned, like the example of the wheelchair ramp not being cleaned off and the competitiveness. I trained in analytical chemistry. My advisor happened to have suffered a spinal cord injury and was in charge of undergraduate teaching. And there's a technique that you often teach in analytical chemistry called titration. And this requires very fine motor control. Often there's a color indicator, et cetera. So for someone in a wheelchair, your face is at the same level as the chemistry. If you have less visual acuity, you can't do the experiment. And if you don't have fine motor control, you can't do the experiment. So he would talk about how, all these accommodations are done to include more people in the experiment. But that's a technique that was developed in the 1800s, and you're training people for the 21st century. So how does digital, and how do you approach design so that the accessibility is baked in, as opposed to thinking, how do we accommodate this standard way of doing things to these multiple cases? And does that drive your design, or does the infrastructure itself need an overhaul? So we don't need to stop worrying about these things.
I think that's a great question. And Chris Ann, you talked about, speaking of accessibility being baked in, you talked about your design system, how it's accessible by default. I'm curious if you have thoughts, and then obviously the rest of the group curious if how you would answer that question.
Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. So thank you for sharing that story. I think one of the great things about accessibility is that it's an opportunity for innovation. I think looking at it through that lens is really powerful. Actually, a disability rights advocate, Haben Goma, that's what she says. Accessibility is the means to innovation. So I would say it's really important to be proactive rather than simply reactive and fixing things as they come along. So in being proactive, I would say that it's baked in terms of processes, but also baked in terms of components. So now I'm speaking purely from the digital space and from the products we design for our customers using the website or mobile app. So when we are designing these components, making sure that even our developers are thinking about accessibility, and by default, it's built with accessibility. So when anyone comes along and utilizes a component, that's not something they need to worry later on. Just as they implement it, they need to keep in mind the background colors, for example. So I hope that answers your question, but thank you so much for sharing your story as well.
Any other thoughts or perspectives on this question from the group? Nailed it. Perfect. Right.
Hello. So something struck me in the conversation. I was thinking, and I swear, I promise this will make sense. But when the internet was first gaining popularity, like the app that made it killer was email, right? Like that was a thing that everybody had. And the perspective of everybody was, this is a letter, but it's electronic, right? And so there was even discussions, but we better tax it so that the post office doesn't go out of business. I mean, these were real conversations that were happening, right? And obviously, it's today we look at like emails used for all sorts of things. Probably shouldn't be, but it's not a letter, right? And it's much more than that's different. The panel's been interesting because I've been thinking about this all along. I had always thought about it as accessibility, or like particularly if you work at the federal level, like we do at Fearless a lot, like 508, right? And we bake it in from the beginning, and you build that way, and you save money and everything like that. But it dawned on me that there's been a trend happening for the last roughly 20 years called mass customization, right? And this is essentially that like you have the low cost of manufacturing at scale, the efficiencies of that, are now able to deliver the high quality of the individualized customization. And I was thinking to the infrastructure question, like changing the infrastructure, and something, Solomon, you said that triggered it was when first it was like just put the article on the web. And then people were like, well, that's not enough. And it kind of hit me that I think what you're all actually talking about is like mass customization, and that you're the quality argument. So instead of arguing for the extra budget, right, like to do this, it's actually staying competitive with the standards, because now everything is being mass customized because of digital transformation in the digital world we live in. So it's not much of a question, but it was more so like an interesting comment that like this is actually inevitable. It's something that's been happening for 20 years, and the movement you're all talking about is just simply a part of that. It's more of the quality.
Yeah. Well, I thank you for that non-question thought. Very thought-provoking. Yeah, curious from the panelists, any thoughts that are stirred up by that?
Honestly, it's funny you mentioned like even personalization. I mean, I think that's something that like when you have the budget for it in a way, like it's possible to do. Like you can customize for every single possible like outcome, right? But like if you Christine said earlier, like if you have it for the mass audience, in most part, you can like at least cover your bases there. But I think for me, it gets to the point where I'm like, okay, not only can we cover a mass audience, but like how can we let people themselves tailor their own experience, so that way, like if we build our site to be for anyone who wants to read it, say if you want to have an experience where like you only want very specific articles, or you only want something that is like from certain authors, or even like a certain type of content, how can we let it so that like you, the user yourself, can actually control that? And I feel like when you give someone that level of accessibility as well, and let them tailor their own experience, that in itself is also like inclusion. It's because people want to feel like they have power over their own experiences in their own life. So.
Yeah. I think you're really getting at the heart of like the inclusion, including people in the design process. I'm reminded of a statistic that I think like overwhelmingly female-bodied passengers die or are injured at higher rates in car accidents. And the reason is because the data that was used to design seat belts and other vehicle safety features were designed around the attributes of male-bodied people. And so like kind of to your point, you can find the efficiencies at scale through mass customizations, but it's all about including people in the process and allowing them to customize. So I think see the clock is counting down. There's about 20 seconds left. Do we have time for one more question, Marty?
Well, maybe this can be quick.
Yeah.
So this is kind of a two-part question. It's related to, Solomon, the answer that you just gave, but that is, what measures do you take to make sure you don't miss something, right? Because there might be something out there that you didn't think of when you're making this design. And what rate of inclusivity is acceptable? If you get to 99% of the population that you're trying to reach, or are you always shooting for 100%?
Big questions.
I can start with the part about reaching 100%. I don't think we could ever reach 100%. That's why I always say it's like a work in progress, and you're constantly improving it. So the main goal is not to hit that we're done, check the box. It's more of constantly working to improve it. Plus, you said, like, what if you miss something along the way? That's why it's really important to have things in place to be proactive. But then the reactive part comes in logging bugs, making sure those bugs are taken care of, in a timely manner, prioritized as important. And then I'll also add is, it takes a village. Like, one person cannot possibly do it alone. I'll say, like, my team that I work with is super passionate about this topic as well, and it really helps having people around who are so passionate. So, with having the village and being proactive and reactive, I think we might never get to 100%, but we'll keep getting closer to it.
Love that. Thank you, Christine. Christine, would you?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's one of those, you're always reaching for the stars and you're never going to get there, but you shouldn't stop trying. So, and it doesn't matter where you start from. So even if you walk away right now and you're like, well, we're like at 40%, we'll never get to 90%. If you got to 45 by the end of the year, that's an improvement. And so just always trying to inch a little bit closer and to be a little bit better is the goal, because there's always going to be a new thing, a new piece of technology, a new TikTok to think about adding in. So even if you're at 100% today, you won't be there in 2 weeks anymore because something new will have come. But building flexible and not building your products to be extremely rigid is also another way, so that you can add on, you can take off, you can bend it and let it move with the Internet of Things, so that you can't build something today that's going to be still viable in 10 years if you don't allow it to have that room to sway.
Any final thoughts for the audience? Okay, I want to thank the panelists for the wisdom and the perspectives. I want to thank the audience for the great questions. We're going to take a short break for the next panel. Thank you.